Lesser Celandine is one of the first plants to flower in late winter and early spring, and apparently this plant has edible starchy tubers. Today I'm going to try them. Lesser Celandine is in the buttercup family. You can sort of see the resemblance in those glossy yellow petals, but whereas buttercups usually have palmate leaves, Celandine has slightly fleshy heart-shaped leaves. A lot of plants in this family are poisonous, some of them quite deadly, like monkshood, which can apparently poison you just by handling it. And Celandine is no exception. This plant is toxic, containing at least two groups of compounds that are harmful to humans. Protoanemone, which is an irritant that can cause a range of toxic effects, including paralysis, and pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which can cause serious liver damage. Despite this, many of my foraging resources say that the leaves and flowers are edible in small quantities, and you shouldn't eat too much, although they don't often specify what amount is too much, which is kind of unhelpful. But it's not the leaves and flowers I'm after today. This plant also produces little underground tubers which are starchy and, according to my research, edible once they're cooked. So let's dig some up and see what they're like. Obviously safety is an issue in several ways here, so I'm not doing this without a great deal of care. More about that in a moment. Now, in the UK, it's generally illegal to dig up any wild plant unless you have permission from the landowner, and this has sometimes presented an obstacle to me in the past, but in this case, I am the landowner. So here we go. I dug up a few plants from different areas, including our little bit of woodland and the flower borders. I'm doing this in mid-May because this is the point where the plant is preparing for dormancy. It's a spring ephemeral, so it's spent a few months photosynthesizing to create carbohydrates to store away in those little tubers. Quite apart from the toxicity issues of this particular plant, it's really important here to be sure about what's being dug up. There are lots of other plants that have various underground tubers, corms and bulbs, and a lot of these are toxic in ways that don't go away when they're cooked. So carelessness is not an option. I made sure that I was tracing the stems down from those heart-shaped leaves that I'd already identified as the right plant. The tubers are quite a bit smaller than I expected, only a few millimetres in diameter, so it was quite a fiddle to get them cleaned up. I started by picking them off into a jug of water. They sink, so I could swish away a lot of the lighter organic material in the soil, and then pick out some of the heavier grit, and eventually I had maybe about a handful of these little tubers. I brought a small pan of salted water to the boil and then dropped them in. Apparently they'll need 15 minutes of boiling, which seems like a lot, but I will follow the advice. Actually, researching the toxicity of this plant was made a little bit more complex than usual because there is another plant, Greater Celandine, completely unrelated to Lesser Celandine. Greater Celandine is in the poppy family, but it's also toxic and in different ways, and some sources seem to muddle or conflate these two different plants. Anyway, after 15 minutes, I drained the cooked tubers and rinsed them in cold water. Some of them have burst out of their skins, but the tubers themselves are still intact. They're now soft and slightly sticky. Because this is the first time of trying this, I decided to taste just a very small amount. The flavour is similar to potato, but with a texture that's perhaps a bit more glutinous and sticky, and also a little bit grainy or mealy. I waited a minute or so, and after this time I began to feel a slight tingling, burning sensation in my mouth and tongue. This is the point where I decided I'm not going to eat any more of these. Now, I think it's worth mentioning at this point that I don't generally consider a taste test to be any kind of reliable way to determine the edibility of a thing. I am aware that there is a taste test procedure that appears in some emergency manuals, but I don't think it's a sensible way to assess an unknown plant if you have any other choices. The only reason I considered it here is because this plant is not unknown, and I've already researched what other people have written about the edibility and the potential effects of any toxins that might be in it. Don't put anything in your mouth unless you know what it is. So the sensations I experienced on eating these things may have just been my imagination, primed by my prior reading of the information, or it may be that there was still a trace of those toxins left in these, despite the cooking. Either way, I stopped right there, and maybe I'm being excessively cautious, but I don't think these are something I will eat again, and neither can I really recommend eating them. But it was interesting to take a look and satisfy my long-standing curiosity about the tubers, and I still decided to make this into a video because I think that deciding not to do a thing when you're uncertain is an absolutely vital part of the thinking that must accompany foraging. I believe it's true that the vast majority of foraging fatalities arise from lack of understanding, and in that context, doubt rather than confidence is actually your best friend. Regardless, I hope this was interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.